Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
There's a deepening trend taking place across America. It's political, it's cultural, it's economic, and it seems as though it's eventually going to affect everything. Whether this change significantly impacts the upcoming midterm elections, however, is still an uncertain quantity. Now, noted physicist Albert Einstein, he once said, quote, "As far as the laws of mathematics refer to reality, they're not certain. And as far as they are certain, they do not refer to reality," end quote. It's a keen summation that has particular relevance for us today. If Einstein's words on the nature of reality and mathematics strike a chord, it's likely because we live in a politicized society where keen observers live and die by the latest polling. We have this overarching belief that political surveys are indicators, and sometimes they are, but sometimes they're also tools of persuasion. We have polls and pundits prognosticating the future. But as with almost everything, the systems of this magnitude are far too complex to parse easily. But there are certain clues, and we'll be diving into what those hints and clues are on today's edition. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's episode, we have with us Editor-in-Chief Lisa K. Donner to discuss the blue exodus on the horizon and some surprising news out of New York State. We'll also be talking Biden's obfuscation on inflation and when it will break. And in our special Talking Liberty segment, we discuss the regulation that's killing a growing Californian industry. I'd like to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Evergreen, Alabama on WNWF 1470 AM and on WPNS on 1140 AM. Thanks for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. With former representative from Hawaii and one-time presidential contender Tulsi Gabbard taking a walk away from the Democratic Party, it's time to ask whether the same follies she accuses Team Biden of committing might be pushing out other Democrats. Now, Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Lisa K. Donner, she's not only been following this particular story, but she's also been following the overall trend, and she joins us here today to discuss the potential exodus from the land of the blue. Welcome back to the show, Lisa, and thanks for being here.
Hi, Mark. How are things on the other side of the pond?
Oh, let's not get too much into the collapsing government or the ever-expanding government, whichever way you want to look at it. Either way, it's like a domino effect. One person falls, the next comes out. Apparently, it's going to be my turn to lead the country soon enough. So, Lisa,
you've got my vote.
Thanks very much. I'll take it. I mean, of course, that would be an illegal vote. Because you're not a resident, but
who cares? It's England, right?
Yeah, that is very true. We tend not to worry too much about the 130% turnout in certain areas. I shan't name them for fear of issues.
Well, you're taking your lead from Philadelphia and Chicago. Oops.
Absolutely. Those are the ones. So, Lisa, for me, there's two aspects to this Tulsi Gabbard and this larger issue of people moving away from the Democratic Party. The first, obviously, is Tulsi Gabbard, and the second is what's taking place in New York. Now, I hope to talk about the New York one later if we have time, but what I want to know about Tulsi is Tulsi's trauma catching?
Well, it's quite auspicious timing she picked. And I actually did something I don't do very often, which is I went to her YouTube and watched the whole 28 minutes. Which I don't think I've done since back when I watched Trump's coming down the escalator. I'm not a big YouTube watcher.
I got to tell you, Lisa, you think that was a chore? And it wasn't a chore. It was more of a pleasure. But I watched the entire Joe Rogan 2 hours 30 interview with Tulsi. So,
wow!
Oh yeah, that's a whole thing. That's a whole other thing. So what was your take on it?
Well, talk about being fed up. You know, I was interested that she came out at this time, just before the November 8 elections. But also, there is a writer on Substack by the name of Sasha Stone, who is a Democrat, and she identifies as a Democrat, but She's right on the Tulsi train. And she
Mm.
talked about that in, I think, a particularly interesting and well-written article, where the true blue Democrats are just, fed up with the excessive need of the party elite to control everyone, control everything. These are pro-choice, pro-environment Democrats, but they're unwilling to surrender themselves and their family to the angry woke mob.
I like the way you use the term surrender there, because it almost seems that many of the people within, we're talking like regular people that you and I know who support Democrats in general. And it feels as though they've almost been kidnapped by the Biden team ideology, doesn't it? It's almost as though they're suffering from not the Helsinki syndrome. What am I thinking? Stockholm syndrome. It's close, but more fish.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if she was the first one to coin this phrase or term or what, but Stone called these people temporary Republicans who are going to need to go to the polls and vote Republican. And then in her article, she kind of ticks down a tweet. I looked on Gabbard's YouTube to look for some comments. And it's interesting because the people that they're talking to, these temporary Republicans or these Tulsi Gabbard Republicans, are really very true blue. I mean, one tweet was from somebody by the name of Madame Kemp, and she wrote, "I'm a pro-choice suburban mom, a longtime blue voter. This November, I'm voting Republican straight down the ticket. The Democrats who lock my kids up can go blank themselves."
I mean, yeah, suburban moms. I mean, that's for the Democrats, that's the golden ticket, isn't it? That's the Willy Wonka golden ticket.
And then without having to look too far beyond that, sorry to cut you off, yeah. I came up on two quotes from Tulsi Gabbard's YouTube. And she had one from a Latin woman and one from a Black man. And both of them are really angry. And that made me think, this new voting bloc they're really hardcore Democrats. They're the Hispanics, they're the Blacks, they're the demographics, the women. These demographics were traditionally, they all belong to the Democratic Party. Now, if you're losing your base, you're hanging out there with a big problem.
Yeah, I wonder how that's going to play out, though. So I can see it happening in the midterms because it's a rebuke, isn't it? That's really what they're getting at here. They're saying, you've left me behind, and so I need you to reconfigure your thinking and come back to be the party that they wanted of them. A pro-life party, a pro-environment party, that kind of thing. It's maybe slightly more government expansion, that kind of stuff. But do you think that will carry on to a 2024 ticket?
Well, my dad, go ahead.
No, because it seems to me that if, for example, if Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis were heading the ticket, which of course it'll almost certainly be one of those, would that be a bridge too far for what Ms. Stone terms the temporary Republicans?
I don't think so. And here's why. My dad used to have a phrase called straighten up and fly right. So whenever we did something that wasn't quite right,
I love the song. I love the song.
That was the command. That was the command. And I think this is what a lot of these temporary Republicans are saying to the Democratic Party: straighten up and fly right. Now, traditionally, what happens when there's nobody you prefer in an election, people stay home. But it seems to me like these temporary Republicans or these Gabbard Republicans are ones that aren't willing to stay home. They really want their voice to be heard by, voting on the Republican ticket.
Yeah, I wrote an article on this recently for libertynation.com where I discussed the circular firing squad of the Democratic Party campaign strategy. And one of the points that I made in that was that the party isn't listening to voter concerns. So, for example, Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, they're pushing that abortion is the key issue for these coming midterms. Whereas all the polling shows that among Republicans, independents, and even Democrats, it's inflation in the economy. And if the party leadership is going to be ignoring what they're telling the party leaders through the polls, then surely there's a frustration there because they're not being listened to, and really not being listened to is one of the biggest sins that you can cast upon an elected leader, isn't it?
Well, the Democrats have the polling operations polling the issue of abortion over and over and over, and they keep hoping for a different result. And the fact is that abortion only polls at a certain level, and it's never as high as the economy. I mean, that's just the way it goes, you know. And I think Gabbard and Stone are providing these Democrats with something that, you know, I've mentioned many times, you're probably sick of hearing, but maybe our listeners and viewers haven't heard, and that's called the permission concept. This is the psychological barrier that's crossed when, let's say, you're all sitting around at a restaurant and the first person doesn't order dessert, right? Then there's like an 80% chance that all the rest aren't going to order dessert. But if the first person does order dessert, I'll take the apple pie, please. You know, the chances are like much higher that everyone else is going to order dessert, or at least most of the table. It's kind of giving people psychological permission. And that's what Gabbard and Stone are talking about, giving Democrats kind of the leeway to know that they're not hanging out there alone. They have psychological permission to go over across the political aisle and the freedom to really vote their conscience.
Well, it's the Republicans' job now to see if they can hold on to those voters. So we're talking with Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Lisa K. Donner, on the Blue Party exodus and the permission concept. After this short break, we'll be back with Lisa talking some surprising midterm information. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Lisa K. Donner. Now, we were just talking about potential running away by former loyal Democrats. Now I want to move on to something that may or may not have similar bearing. What's the latest news out of New York State?
Well, it's interesting. I hate to go against what my husband thinks about a race because he's our senior political analyst and he's very astute politically.
He is rarely wrong. By Tim Donner,
he is really wrong, and
stuff.
he thinks I'm conjuring this up and out of a Halloween hope, but I don't think I am. So we actually have a difference of opinion. Imagine that, a married couple with a difference of opinion. But anyway, the latest polls have the race between Kathy Hochul, who, let's remember, was not elected, but took over for the disgraced Andrew Cuomo. Anyway, Hochul and Lee Zeldin, her challenger, are getting closer. Now, my husband says, yeah, but not that close.
Yeah, it's I believe it's around 4% difference, which, let's be fair, in New York State, that's not bad. 4% is, I mean, that's practically a win. I mean, let's put it this way. Maybe you're both correct. Maybe both you and Tim Donner are correct that you know, it's super close and it could take it, but maybe just not. But wouldn't really a loss for Kathy Hochul be if Lee Zeldin gets within a couple of percent? Wouldn't that just be a major loss anyway?
Well, my husband kind of goes by the RCP average. That's what he looks at a lot. I don't trust it quite as much as he does, but the RCP average has Hochul up by 6 points. But, and this is a huge but, Trafalgar, which is a polling operation that I have much more faith in because their methodology is different, and frankly, because they tend to be right.
They have a good track record. Very true.
Their last poll in early October, end of September, early October, had Hochul up by 2 points. Now that's inside their margin of error, which was like around 2.8, 2.9. So clearly something is going on. Now, again, my husband is a New Yorker, native New Yorker, and he's, seen many a mayoral and gubernatorial race in New York over his 60-some years. And he thinks I'm still whistling Dixie. And let's remember, the last GOP governor of New York was George Pataki, who served 2 terms in 2007. So, it can happen. It has happened. Will it happen again? The only thing I will say is that I found it interesting that Zeldin almost trounced by a 2-to-1 margin Andrew Giuliani, the son of Rudy, who was the great, mayor of
America's mayor, yeah.
America's mayor, right? Took us through 9/11.
Yeah, I think a lot of that was because obviously we've been talking about Democrats in our earlier segment, and there's a lot of anti-Trumpism amongst Democrats, and of course Rudy Giuliani, as Trump's personal lawyer for certain things, is very much entwined with that legacy. So the idea of voting for a Giuliani is the same as voting for a Trump in their minds, perhaps.
Yeah, and by the way, you cannot discount the fact that the crime issue is so big in New York. And I know it's a statewide thing, and what we see on TV all the time is mostly New York City. But the crime issue is really jazzing up a lot of Democrats and Republicans in New York. It's really bad. It's gotten worse. And that may be the key to turning this race around for Zeldin. It would certainly be a big upset, we'll say that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, anything where Zeldin comes close to Hochul would be an upset for the Democratic Party. I mean, some of the latest numbers that come out, I may not have these exactly right, but there's obviously the Republicans within New York are voting for Zeldin. There's a small portion of Democrats who are voting for Zeldin. But the big news is the independents. Among independents, Zeldin has a 20-point lead. And that's crazy. I mean, you cut away the tribalism, cut away the, if I may interject a brief anecdote here. Writer P.J. O'Rourke, who I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with, often related the story about he went home from college and he told his grandmother that, "Grandma, I'm a communist." And she said, "Well, at least you're not a Democrat." And I always appreciate that.
That's a great story.
P.J. O'Rourke was full of great stories.
That's right up there with the William F. Buckley story when he ran for mayor. And a reporter asked him, "What would happen if you won?" And Buckley said, "Well, I'd ask for a recount." Or demand. I think he said demand a recount.
Demand a recount.
Really funny.
The
key there, Mark, let me just say one thing, sure. Comment about the independents. The key there is getting those independents to the polls.
Yes.
You know, instead of just saying, I don't like either Hochul, I can't stand Zeldin, knock yourselves out. Something has to generate these people to go to the polls. And I think the crime issue is it. Now, my husband could probably tell you a lot more about the demographics of how much New York City versus the rest of the state, blah, 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 blah. I don't have that at my fingertips, but I do see a race that was considered to be an easy walkover tightening in the last few weeks of towards the election.
And that could well be a bellwether for the midterms overall. Lisa K. Donna, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Down the road, we discuss California expanding the war on drugs. But up next, how is Biden administration spinning the inflation debacle? Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
If it seems to you that the Biden administration is speaking in forked tongue over the consequences and parameters of inflation, well, you're not alone. First, it was transitory. Then it was time limited, and all coincidentally, the term to avoid midterm decimation. Somebody who's been following the rise, the fall, and the extended flow of America's inflation debacle is Liberty Nation's host of the excellent Swamponomics show, Mr. Andrew Moran, who joins us here today. Welcome aboard, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, they started telling us that it was transitory. Now they're saying that it will, the effects of Joe Biden's oddly named Inflation Reduction Act, to which many people say will do the opposite of reducing inflation, won't take effect until after the midterms. What's the deal?
Well, actually, even before transitory, Joe Biden and the Federal Reserve and Janet Yellen, they all said that actually inflation was not going to happen. So that was even that preceded transitory. But when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, she was asked about this the other day, and she said, "Oh yeah, you're not going to see the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act until early next year," which is funny though, because that's when inflation should be coming down at a significant rate if you follow what the Federal Reserve projections are. And the White House, even before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, their forecast was that inflation would fall below 3% by early next year. So I guarantee you, as we talked about a few weeks ago on this program, is that if inflation does come down, and it should because everything the Federal Reserve is doing, they're going to say, oh yeah, it's because of the Inflation Reduction Act, even though most experts know better.
There's two aspects on this that really stand out to me, Andrew. First is that what you're saying is that if the federal government had done nothing, then inflation would likely be coming down at the beginning of next year anyway.
Yeah, well, if you look at the Federal Reserve's money supply growth data, I mean, that thing has cratered from where it was just 2 years ago. So that's a considerable aspect of the inflation issue. Demand is falling in nearly every aspect of the economy. Recession is killing the supply chain crisis itself. So the market factors are what, and the Federal Reserve slow down of the printing press. Those are the real factors of what's going to hopefully ease inflation, not government spending more. Because also, if you think about it too, the federal government, if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, they talk about all these tax credits and giving all these benefits away. But if that's injecting more money into the economy, what you want is fewer dollars chasing too few goods in the economy. So overall, that's why economists say the Inflation Reduction Act will probably ease inflation just by 0.1%, which is of course inconsequential.
So that kind of brings me on to the second point. Are you saying that we could be going into the new year with politicians celebrating a reduction in inflation, but at the same point, the nation will be in a recession?
Well, the recession, I mean, the U.S. technically is in the middle of a recession, but if you just want to go by what everyone else says, then a recession, according to Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, or Bloomberg Economics, they'll say recession is nearly 100% next year. Stephen Hanke, he's one of the great modern day economists. He says pretty much what I say about the money supply growth data, how that is at 0%, that's going to lead to a tremendous recession. So yeah, I mean, that's the issue with inflation, that you're going to need the recession to kill inflation, and especially with how dependent the economy is on all this massive, liquidity that was injected into the marketplace during the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, heading into 2022.
So we bandy these things around, Andrew, that a recession will help kill inflation. But I think from my point of view, who doesn't understand the intricacies of the economics field, and I'm sure for many Americans, which one is worse, the inflation continuing along or to have a recession? Now, let's take this on a couple of different levels if we can. Sure. So let's say your average American family, which one is worse for them? Inflation as it is now and continuing, or as it is now at the current levels around 8.3, 8.5, or a recession?
See, that's excuse me, that's a common question, because there's an old saying that if my neighbor loses my job, it's a recession. If I lose my job, it's a depression. The problem is, in that type of scenario, the way the Federal Reserve is handling things, they're trying to create millions of job losses to help fight inflation. Now, if you read my work on Liberty Nation, you have something called the Phillips curve, where they think that there's a trade-off where in order to have low inflation, you have to have high unemployment, or if you have high inflation, you have low unemployment. Problem is that's been debunked for so long. But overall, I mean, if you look at right now, the jobs economy, the job market is incredible. I mean, 3.5% unemployment rate. You have hundreds of thousands of jobs being created every month. Problem is, if you look at the wage growth has been negative for all 18 months of the current administration. So even if you have a strong job market, your wages are being eroded.
That's real wage growth.
Real wage growth, which is inflation adjusted. So the latest numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics is just under -4%. So you're losing money just by working. Now,
stay home, everybody. Words from the economist: stay home. No more quiet quitting. Just quit.
just get those sweet stimulus checks, those stimmy checks, as everyone called it. But with a recession, inflation kills demand, and that's what's going to bring down inflation. Problem, the trade-off is that you have declining economic growth because the U.S. economy is 2/3 consumption.
So there's no real way to pass which is better for the American people.
Exactly. You're picking your poison. Do you want a recession or do you want inflation? But the real problem is that it's not so much the recession and what comes after the recession. So if you look after 2008, you had, you know, the Great Recession. But after that, you had such anemic growth of, you know, less than 2%. I think of in US history, Barack Obama had the third worst post-recession economic record in the nation's history because growth was so anemic. I think you're going to have that again. But the problem is that you've had all this money expansion. You've had all this debt accumulation in nearly every aspect of the economy, plus from the federal government. You have $32 trillion national debt. So I think it was Nouriel Roubini. He wrote an op-ed in Time magazine the other day, and he said you're going to have the great stagflationary debt crisis, where he said that it's going to be a combination of the 1970s stagflation with the post-2008 debt crisis. But of course, debt is even higher than it was at the time, plus interest rates are higher than it was at the time.
Isn't that similar to what
the future is terrifying?
Isn't that what happened to Japan with their lost decade?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then what's funny too is that I wrote about that a couple of years ago. I said how the United States is going to have the 2020s. We're in 2020s right now. It's going to be the lost decade of the United States because of all this debt accumulation, you know, stagnating economic growth. You look at all the economic metrics. The U.S. is in a terrible place right now, and this is all because of the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government during the early days of the pandemic. It's not going to get better, and I don't know how. I don't know if there's any panacea whatsoever except slashing the size of government and slowing down the printing presses, allowing markets to, you know, function correctly without government constantly intervening. Or if I may quote Joe Biden, "I'm not concerned about the dollar. I'm concerned about the rest of the world." Does that make sense? It's worldwide inflation.
I wish for you listening on radio at home there, here on the Radio American Network, that you could have seen Andrew's face whilst doing that impersonation. Now, let's briefly touch on Joe Biden. One more question for you, but it's more from the political angle than the economics. So Joe Biden says that if America elects a Republican-led Congress in November, that inflation will get worse. What does that even mean? Does he mean that they will take different actions to what he's taken? And surely that's a good thing, right?
You need a Biden translator to understand anything that Joe Biden says. But yeah, I saw that comment too, and I don't know. I don't know how to answer that because I don't know what the Republicans could do when they're in Congress if they can, you know, make inflation higher. I mean, I've said before. I did a Swaponomics TV recently, a mailbag edition, and somebody asked me, "Oh, what could the Republicans do to help fight inflation?" And the only answer I could possibly think of is that they could act as obstructionists, whereby they could help stop the government from spending so much money, stop approving new spending. But of course, Republicans have a terrible track record that they'll probably just, you know, tergiversate and approve new spending. But hopefully the GOP, the active structures, I guess with President Biden, it's more of a fundamental issue of what has been the contributing factor of inflation. He comes with all these different excuses when the root cause of inflation was just, you know, fiscal expansion, monetary expansion.
Yeah, allegedly this was a president who was going to get to the root causes of many things, from open border, lax security, and of course inflation.
And Vice President Kamala Harris, she solved the issue in South America by agreeing to plant new trees. That solved the migrant crisis right there.
Planting new money trees, hopefully. Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll be right back after this short break with our special Talking Liberty segment discussing California's regulatory whirlwind. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with our signature Talking Liberty segment, in which we analyze the affronts to freedom and the liabilities attached to liberty in the modern day. And more importantly, how they impact you. And we're joined, as always, by the custodian of constitutional correctness, host of the Uprising podcast, and Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Welcome back to the show,
and number
Scott.
one fan of Liberty Nation Radio, Mark. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Hopefully that's not a Kathy Bates style number one fan, and I'll be hobbled a la James Caan in the Misery movie by Stephen
No,
King.
I saw a good meme the other day, by the way, and it was like, "This is the government." You know, it was Kathy
Yes,
Bates. It's
Kathy
like,
Bates. I love you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That make an appearance on the Liberty Nation conservative meme of the day.
I tell you what, Scott, I'll put that up on Monday morning for all of
Fantastic.
those radio listeners. They can check out the daily conservative meme on libertynation.com. It's a cracking little selection of memes to make you laugh. So, Scott, what I want to talk about today, it comes in the wake of Joe Biden's swath of pardons for marijuana possession, people who have been sent to prison for marijuana possession. And so we kind of assume that there's very much a liberalization of the approach to marijuana in the United States. And yet, California's marijuana legalization programs and efforts, they've gone so poorly that I'm reading that they're actually expanding the drug war.
All right. Well, there's a couple things there to unpack.
Really,
all right,
gotten things so bad that they have to do it the complete
it's
opposite.
not that
of the
their
rest of the
efforts
country.
have gone so poorly. It's that they, what is the effort designed to do? Suppress the growing of marijuana. It's not successful there. They want all marijuana to be grown within the confines of their taxable and regulatable structure that they've laid out. The problem is that those regulations and taxes are so onerous that the people who are growing marijuana illegally still see enough of the profit motive to overcome the criminal behavior. Basically, why do we have drug dealing and drug sales in the United States? Same idea. It's worth more than the penalty for those who choose. Same thing here. But
Scott, there seems to be a lesson here that I just want to interrupt to make sure that we're understanding the moral significance on this. Now, are you saying that people who
Mark, before I want you to put a pin in your question, if you would. Okay, I understand what you're trying to get to, but I think what I should have done first was talk about the Biden pardon, because there's a lot to get into with these state issues. But first, let's talk, if we might, about that federal pardon issue.
Okay, I'd have a couple of questions I'd like cleared up on the Biden mass pardoning thing. Am I right in thinking that there's nobody presently in prison for marijuana possession that would be impacted by this, but the benefit of it comes in having their rights returned? Is that correct?
All the federal prisoners who were there because of marijuana convictions only at the federal level have been let out as a result of Biden's pardons. They amounted to a number of 0 persons, as we can best determine. Yeah. So he got
that 0 person is very happy today, though, and no doubt casting his midterm vote.
There are some people who will no doubt have better lives because they don't have a conviction on their records that they otherwise would have. So I don't mean to minimize the action for those people.
Yeah. They have their rights
what
fully
we do minimize, what we must minimize, is the idea that Joe Biden has acted at all to the extent that he has the power to legalize or normalize marijuana in the United States. He's literally done. It's almost like a genius move in a way, Mark. Like, if you could devise a way to get, tons and tons of ink spilled that you did A, but actually none of A really happened, and you didn't do anything to actually move the needle. That's what it's like, some magic trick of some sorts. When I first heard the news, I rejoiced as somebody who opposes marijuana prohibition in the United States and everywhere. And then I started looking at what actually happened, and it was just so remarkable that he did nothing. There are now.
Scott, it reminds me of there's an old question that used to be asked, and it kind of represented a range of questions that would be used as gotchas towards politicians. This seems that this is the opposite. And the question was, tell me, when did you stop beating your wife? And of course, there's no particular answer. Either
Joe Biden
I never have, or I never started.
Joe Biden didn't even send an email to his army of federal prosecutors that are working today to say, oh, by the way, don't prosecute any more of these crimes. In other words, there's been no guidance, no additional guidance for Biden to do this.
So let's see how this ties in with California's marijuana legalization. The point I was trying to get to earlier is that, as with many laws, that there are always going to be people willing to break them if the motive is enough, which is why gun laws, for example, and I'm sure that you saw exactly where I was going with this, that if we outlaw all guns, only outlaws will have guns. I mean, let's be fair, California is a regulation state. It's the regulatory driver of the United States, or at least tries to be, as recent Supreme Court cases will attest. But because of the need within the state, the political need within the state for regulation, that it's forcing people for monetary gain to stick with the illegal growing. Is that about right?
The taxing and regulation is so heavy that it has created a massive spread in the marketplace for what you can grow and sell marijuana for, not participating with the state system, versus what you can sell, versus, what it costs, and then you can recover if you were within the state system. And so the growers and sellers are just exploiting that spread.
Am I right in thinking, though, that because of obviously free market economics does work even in California, that the legal growers and distributors are basically they're fighting a losing battle, aren't they?
I think that there's always going to be a market for the legal product for people who don't mind paying the extra money. But for the bargain hunters, they're fighting a losing battle, and that they'll fully extinguish those sales because as long as that discount exists and it's significant enough, I think the market will fill that void. There's a way to talk about this without talking about marijuana real quick, which is just that American mafia families got a great deal of business by running what they call the daily number. And the daily number is just a lottery number. It was before the governments decided to get into the lottery business. But the governments did get into the lottery business because they saw how much money the mob was making. So what does the mob do? They pay out more per dollar than the government does. If you buy a lottery ticket for $1 in America, the total return on that ticket might be like 72 cents or something like that. And then you add a dime or more for the mob return. So they're providing more value in the marketplace, less overhead, and they have been successful in maintaining their numbers rackets. That's what they call it. You hear the numbers rackets when like it's some.
Yeah, I've read my Mario Puzo, and it's really
that's what that's about, right?
It's really no coincidence that the mafia came to prominence during Prohibition.
Yeah,
it's no coincidence there at all.
So it's the same idea here. These people are not participating in the government tax and regulation thing. One of the points that Scott Shackford, Reason reporter who wrote about this, made was that it's such a union-friendly state. You're going to get these people to cut your marijuana down. You'd think you could get, you'd think that would be a job that you'd be able to pay a very minimal amount for. But if you have to pay California union wages and, full dental and medical and send their kids to college, well, you can imagine that it makes sense to grow some weed in the mountains and the hills,
Yeah, and of course, there's the stuff that's imported as well, because imports are always cheaper across the porous border.
They grow it local because it's easier that way. That's part of what the California Attorney General Rob Bonta sort of selling this measure as. It's protecting California natural resources. And it's true that these grows are detrimental to the natural resources. They use chemicals. As you can imagine, they're not great stewards of the land like maybe somebody else would be. If you're growing an illegal marijuana grow in parkland. But at the same time, that's not the reason that we see motivating the California government. It's more about money. They eradicated 158,000 marijuana plants in 1984, Mark. In 2022, after marijuana has been legalized in California, we've got the pardon thing for nationally. They eradicated 974,000 plants just last week. So that's the level of where things are.
When government gets involved, that's just the way of things. Scott DiCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark. Bye-bye.
And that's almost it for this edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard on the Radio America Network. I want to take a moment to thank our guests, Lisa K. Donner, Andrew Moran, and Scott DiCosenza. And of course, you, the listener at home, for tuning in. My parting thought for this week, Voltaire once said, "One day everything will be well. That is our hope. Everything's fine today. That is our illusion." And that's what we have today. The political facts, the political promises that are made, they are indeed illusions. We are being lied to. We are misled, all with the promise of tomorrow being better than today. But as you all know by now, tomorrow never comes. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.